The rain has not stopped in Hanover since the last chord rang out, and the crowd outside the arena has thinned to almost nothing. Buses are being loaded, roadies are coiling cable in the dark. But across the square, in the shadow of an old stone church that somehow survived the bombs of a war most of the audience never lived through, one figure has not moved. An old woman stands, soaked to the bone, her eyes locked on a single door, waiting for someone she has never officially met to walk through it. When Klaus Meine finally steps outside, still catching his breath, still ringing with the roar of thousands of voices, he stops cold at the sight of her. Because he already knows exactly who she is, and exactly why she is standing there in the freezing dark. This is not the first time. It will not be the last. For the next 4 decades, every single time the Scorpions come home to play Hanover, this same woman will be waiting outside this same church for him and only him. And one day, an old man now, Klaus Meine will sit down with the newest member of his band and tell him, for the first time out loud, exactly why. To understand that night, you first have to understand Hanover. This was a city stitched back together after the bombs of the Second World War, half-rebuilt churches standing next to modern glass storefronts, an entire generation learning to rebuild and to love again amid the rubble. Rudolf Schenker had started the Scorpions here in 1965, a scrappy group of teenagers chasing American rock and roll on borrowed amplifiers in a country still finding its footing. By the time Klaus Meine joined as lead singer in 1969, replacing an earlier vocalist, the band was still years away from anything resembling fame, still hauling their own gear into smoky clubs for a handful of marks a night. That particular evening, after a modest club show near the old market square, Klaus walked out expecting an empty street, the usual quiet after a gig nobody outside Hanover would ever remember. Instead, he found her, standing perfectly still beneath the street lamp. She held something pressed against her chest, wrapped carefully in a plastic bag to keep it from the rain. She did not ask for an autograph. She did not ask for a photograph, decades before that would even be a common request. She simply looked at him, the way you look at someone you have been waiting your whole life to meet, and quietly said his name. Her name was Ilse. She told him plainly that she was not there for the music, not exactly, though the music mattered more than he could yet understand. Slowly, carefully, the way you handle something that has already survived far too much, she unwrapped the object from its plastic covering. It was a photograph, its edges gone soft from years of handling, showing a young man in a simple suit, laughing at something just outside the doors of that very church. That was Eric, she said, her husband. They had been married right there in the early 1950s, when Hanover was still full of rubble and cautious hope in equal measure. Eric had loved American music more than almost anything, she told him, smuggled in over crackling late-night radio signals that were never supposed to reach this side of the border. He had dragged her, reluctant and a little embarrassed, to see a scrappy young local band play in a half-ruined hall not long before he died suddenly of a weak heart, far too young, far too soon. That band, she said, had been the Scorpions. Klaus stood frozen in the rain, stunned into silence, as she quietly told him that hearing his voice on a record was the closest thing she had to hearing her husband laugh again. Before he even realized what he was saying, Klaus made her a promise, standing right there under that street lamp. Whenever the band played Hanover, he told her, he would come find her. He kept that promise through years most young bands never survive long enough to see. Lonesome Crow arrived in 1972, raw and largely unnoticed outside Germany. Fly to the Rainbow followed in 1974, then In Trance, then Virgin Killer, each record inching the Scorpions further from obscurity and closer to something real. Through every one of those hometown shows, while the rest of the band loaded amplifiers or fielded questions from local reporters, Klaus would quietly slip away toward the church square the moment he could. Roadies learned not to ask questions about where their singer had disappeared to. Bandmates learned to cover for him with promoters and club owners, wondering why the star of the night had vanished into the dark. Ilse was there every single time, rain or clear sky, holding that same photograph a little more carefully each year as its edges wore as soft as fabric. They rarely spoke for long. A few minutes on a cold church step, a cup of coffee poured from a thermos she always brought herself, insisting he drink it before he caught a chill. She never once asked him for anything money could buy, never asked for backstage passes or favors for a grandchild. She only wanted 5 minutes with the voice that reminded her of Eric. And Klaus, barely into his 20s himself back then, found he needed those 5 minutes almost as much as she did. Then came the years nobody around that half-ruined club could have predicted. Lovedrive cracked America open in 1979. Blackout turned arenas into a second home in 1982. And in 1984, Love at First Sting made the Scorpions genuine global superstars. Rock You Like a Hurricane, blasting out of car radios from Hanover to Houston, from Tokyo to Rio de Janeiro. Klaus Meine was no longer a struggling singer sneaking out of a half-empty club. He was flying between continents, doing interviews in 5 languages in a single afternoon, recognized in airports on the far side of the world by teenagers who had never set foot in Germany. And still, every single time the tour looped back through Hanover, while limousines idled at the curb and handlers checked their watches, Klaus would walk straight past all of it, coat collar up, heading for the old church square. Ilse was older now, leaning on a cane, her hair gone fully silver, but she was always there, exactly where she had always been. Bandmates who once quietly teased him about his strange little disappearing act slowly began to understand they were watching something rare, something that had nothing to do with rock stardom at all. Fame had changed nearly everything about their lives except this one stubborn, unbreakable habit that Klaus refused to let go of, no matter how large the arenas grew around him. Nothing tested that habit quite like the year 1989. The Scorpions played the Moscow Music Peace Festival that summer, standing on a stage in the heart of a crumbling Soviet Union, watching young Russian fans weep and sing along to songs they had only ever heard smuggled onto worn cassette tapes. Months later, the Berlin Wall came down, and Klaus, watching a divided country become whole again on television screens around the world, sat down and wrote the words that would become Wind of Change, released in 1990 on the album Crazy World, a song that would eventually become the anthem of an entire falling wall. When the tour finally brought him home to Hanover that same year, Ilse was waiting exactly as always, but for once, she was the one who did most of the talking. She had lived through the division of Germany as a young bride, had watched the country she loved split in two not long after she buried her husband. She told Klaus what it felt like to watch a wall fall in her own lifetime, something she had genuinely never believed she would live to see. Klaus realized, sitting on those cold church steps beside a woman who had quietly lived through more history than he ever would, that their strange yearly ritual had become something far bigger than either of them. It was a thread tying his enormous, impossible new life back to the small, rain-soaked truth of exactly where he came from. The thread held for years longer, through Face the Heat, through Pure Instinct, through tours that carried the band across 5 continents and back again more times than Klaus could count. Then, one Hannover night, deep in the 1990s, Klaus walked out of the stage door toward the church square the way he had 100 times before, and for the first time in over 2 decades, it was empty. No cane, no plastic bag pressed carefully against a coat, no familiar shape waiting patiently in the dark beneath that same street lamp. His stomach dropped before his mind had even caught up to why. He stood there a long moment, telling himself she was simply running late, that the rain had kept her home this once, that there had to be some ordinary explanation. Then a young woman he had never seen before stepped out from beneath the church's stone archway, holding an envelope toward him with visibly trembling hands, her face pale under the streetlight. She introduced herself as Ilse's granddaughter. Ilse had passed peacefully in her sleep only a few weeks earlier, she explained, her voice catching. And in her final days, she had made her whole family promise something unusual. That if the Scorpions ever played Hannover again, someone had to be standing at that church to find the singer and place this envelope in his hands personally. Klaus opened it right there under the street lamp, his own hands unsteady now, too. Inside was the photograph of Eric, the very one Ilse had carried to every single hometown show for more than 20 years, its edges worn soft as cloth, alongside a short handwritten note in careful, old-fashioned script. It thanked him, simply, for giving her husband's laugh back to her, one hometown night at a time, for far longer than she had ever expected to still be alive to receive it. Klaus Meine, a man who had sung in front of hundreds of thousands of people without ever missing a single note, stood alone in a rainy German square that night and wept like a boy. He kept coming back to that church anyway. For a long while, he told almost no one why, not even his closest bandmates. He would still slip away after Hannover shows, still sit alone on those same worn stone steps, holding a memory instead of a conversation, unwilling to let a promise made in the rain simply end just because the person he made it to was gone. The lineup around him kept shifting through the decades that followed, the way lineups always do in a band that refuses to stop touring. Matthias Jobs became a permanent fixture on guitar. Francis Buchholz eventually gave way to newer bass players. Herman Rarebell's drums were passed down to James Kotak. Through Crazy World, through Face the Heat, through a farewell tour in 2010 that somehow turned out not to be a farewell at all, Klaus quietly carried Ilse's story with him, a private piece of Hannover he never fully explained to anyone, even as the band kept charging forward into a future none of its founders could have imagined back in that rubble-strewn city in 1965. Then, in 2016, a new drummer joined the Scorpions, a towering, silver-maned musician named Mickey D, stepping into a chair once occupied by legends. He came to the band, already a legend in his own right, the powerhouse behind Motorhead for over 2 decades, a man who had stood beside Lemmy Kilmister on some of the loudest stages in rock history. Now he was the newest member of a band that had already survived 50 years of lineup changes, world tours, and history-shaking moments most musicians only read about in books. Mickey learned the songs, learned the stage, learned the quiet rhythms of a brotherhood decades in the making. But there was one thing about Klaus Meine that puzzled him from his very first Hannover homecoming show. After the lights went down and the crowd emptied into the streets outside, Klaus would vanish, quietly and deliberately, toward an old church across the square. Alone, every single time, no matter how tired he clearly was, or how late the hour had grown. One night, years later, during the Rock Believer tour, Mickey finally followed him instead of heading straight for the bus. He found Klaus sitting alone on the worn stone steps of that same old church, an aging photograph resting gently in his hands, his eyes somewhere far away in time. Mickey almost turned back right then, sensing he had stumbled into something deeply private, something not meant for him. But Klaus glanced up, and instead of asking him to leave, he simply patted the cold stone beside him and asked his newest bandmate to sit down. And there, decades after a rainy night in the early 1970s, an aging Klaus Meine finally told the whole story out loud, from the very beginning, to someone hearing every word of it for the first time in his life. He told Mickey about Ilse, about Eric's laugh, about a promise made in the rain by a 20-something singer who had no idea his little band would ever leave Germany, let alone conquer the world. He told him about the coffee poured from her thermos, about wind of change and a wall coming down, about the night the plastic bag was missing from that street lamp and an envelope took its place instead. Mickey D., a man who had already lived an entire lifetime inside rock and roll before ever joining the Scorpions, sat quietly on those church steps and listened, understanding for the first time what this strange hometown ritual truly meant. It was not superstition. It was not sentiment for its own sake. It was Klaus Meine's way of proving, quietly, to himself and to no one else, that no matter how big the stages became, no matter how many continents the band conquered, some promises made to one grieving stranger outside a church were worth keeping for an entire lifetime. Klaus looked at Mickey in the dark and said simply that fame fades, arenas empty, and records eventually stop selling. But a promise kept for 40 years, that outlives all of it. And somewhere in that quiet Hannover night, listening to an old singer's voice crack over an old woman's memory, the newest Scorpion finally became part of the story too.